Welcome, everyone, and good morning. My name is Ginger Williams, and I am the Rural Health Specialist in the Eastern Region with CSU Extension. Welcome to our CSU Extension Caregiver Series with Jane Barton of Cardinal Health. We started this series this past spring and have grown our audience so much that we needed to expand capacity. So welcome to all of our new attendees, as well as those who have been with us since the spring. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please note this webinar is being recorded in English and Spanish, and both recordings will be posted to the CSU Extension YouTube channel about a week after the presentation. I will also be sending out recordings directly to all registrants. Please note that attendees will not appear on camera or have the ability to turn on video or sound during the presentation. However, we would like this to be an interactive and engaged conversation following the presentation, so we ask that you type any of your questions into the Q&A function. Following the presentation, I will moderate the Q&A session with Jane, so keep your questions coming. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the fabulous Jane Barton. Jane Barton is the author of Caregiving for the Genius, is a passionate national speaker, writer, and listener. As the founder of Cardinal LLC, she provides educational programs, books, videos, podcasts, and blogs to assist people in confronting the daunting challenges posed by aging, serious illness, caregiving, and the end of life. And we are ready to go, Jane.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Ginger. Let me share my screen. And away we will go. So yay, I am so excited to be here today and to welcome you to our first episode in our educational series entitled When You Care. Now, although we can't be together physically, thank goodness we have technology, and just know that I'm sending you a very warm welcome through cyberspace. I would also like to extend my heartfelt thanks to CSU Extension. Ginger has been wonderful to work with, as are all the other individuals online today. And Sue Schneider was my initial contact with CSU, and we've had a lot of fun chatting and creating and plotting and planning. And so just know it's my delight, my privilege, and my honor to be here today. Ginger gave you a little bit of information about me, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I am an educational consultant, which means I get to do what I love every single day. And that is to serve as a speaker, a writer, and/or a listener. And I focus on the topics I'm passionate about: aging, end-of-life care, and caregiving. Now, I have a rather curious career path, and I own that. It's noted in the handout associated with this program. But prior to working in hospice and palliative care starting in 2004 as a chaplain and then a community educator, I worked in finance for a short period of time, and I also had a 16-year career as a geologist in the oil patch. So go figure. But of greater relevance to our conversation today is my personal journey, and I think you'll resonate with this. I was called to care for my mom when I was 15, and that was the formative event of my life. My mom was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer, and over the 8.5 years that my family and I cared for her, I learned so much. And I think the primary lesson of importance was I learned that knowledge is power. And without knowledge, life can be pretty darn scary. And so every time today, when I speak, when I write, I think of you, the audience. What information might be beneficial to you when challenged by life so that you can make informed choices instead of merely reacting out of fear, which never serves us well. And that's my mission today. My mission is to say something to you today that will help you make some difficult choices along the way. We're going to talk about the consequences of caring. Now, whether you're currently serving as a caregiver or you're anticipating a call to care, I think there are some lessons to be learned and things to be planned for. So we're going to have a heartfelt chat about the following question. First, we're going to recognize who cares in our country today and the importance of family caregivers. Then we will look at some of the consequences of caring. What does it mean when we answer a call to care? How does that affect our lived experience? Then we will look at the potential blessings of caring, because it's both burdens and blessings when we answer this call. And then finally, I just want to make you aware that when the journey of caregiving ends, oftentimes that can be a bumpy transition as well. So we need to anticipate that and to plan for it. So let's begin by talking about who cares, the role of the family caregiver. I love this sentiment from Connie Goldman, who wrote The Gifts of Caregiving. She says, caregiving is our universal destiny. She is echoing the sentiment of another person that I admire and revere, and that is Rosalind Carter, a former First Lady. And whether you know it or not, she is a huge advocate and champion for family caregivers. And she was known to have said that there are only four kinds of people in the world today: those of us who have cared, those of us who are caring, those of us who will care, and we will all require care at some point in time. So caregiving is a common concern, a common cause, it's common ground. We will all be called to care at some point in time. And many of us are called multiple times, depending on the scenario within our family system. And that's because care is the human glue that holds us together. It holds our families together, our communities together, our societies together. And that's because we are relational creatures. We not only need each other, we want each other. And when we band together, we inherently care for one another. And that is a good thing indeed. So I think it's important as we consider this call to care, assuming the role of a caregiver, we need to know the basics about this. What can we expect? What can we anticipate? What should we prepare for? That will help us to understand why caregiving is consequential. It changes our life forever. Well, the basics of caregiving start with this particular point. Family caregivers are the backbone of care in our country today. If you look at the research, 80 to 90% of all the care that we receive from the time we are born until the time we die, it's offered by family and friends. And so we definitely need each other in this proposition of caring. And that's a good thing because we can't afford to pay for all the care we require. And we don't want to because we look to the people we know and we trust and hopefully love. We look to our family to care for us. And we expect them to look at us when they need care in return. As a consequence, that means there are about 40 to 60 million family caregivers caring for members of their family and community at any one point in time. So family members, we carry the cost of caregiving. And I'm not just talking about financial cost. I'm talking about the physical, the emotional, psychosocial, and also spiritual cost of care. Now, there are some trends that complicate this journey of caring, which we need to be mindful of today, because this is the stage upon which we care for each other. It's very different than, say, in the early 1900s. Families today are geographically dispersed. So it makes it much more difficult if your loved one is 1,000 miles away. You are not there to care, even though you might want to. Also, today, families are typically smaller. Individuals and couples choose to have fewer children. So there are fewer hands and hearts in the younger generation to care for the aging population. We also have more blended families because divorce is not stigmatized like it was in previous generations. And so you have step parents and stepchildren and half siblings. And we know family dynamics are difficult enough, but when you have blended families, it just enhances the complexity of the relationships and the delegation of responsibilities. There's also another complicating factor, and that's the fact that many individuals are going solo. And sometimes that's by default, sometimes by design. But these are individuals that are living alone and they are aging alone. And that makes it very problematic when care is required because there's not a naturally occurring support system within the home to care for that person. So just things to be mindful of. Another complicating factor is because we are so dispersed as families, long distance caregiving is becoming much more common. In fact, about 11% of the overall population of caregivers. Now, long distance caregiving is defined as being at least 1 hour away from the person that you're caring for. So, obviously, this requires additional time for travel. It also incurs an additional expense, and it's emotionally distressing for a lot of long distance caregivers. Now, how much time is required for care? Well, on average, predicated on surveys and research, a family caregiver will be asked to do something on average 24 hours a week. So it's more than a part time job. And what's the duration or length of care? On average, 4.5 years. Now, I highlight this to just reinforce the fact that when we're called to care, this isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's not just a little blurb on your radar screen. This is a life-changing moment. It's a huge commitment, and we need to recognize that going into the proposition. Now, this is true for both men and women. Men and women are both called to care, and it's about a 40-60 split, again, predicated on some surveys that have been done within the past 3 or 4 years. Another important point to remember is that the majority of care recipients rely solely on one person for the care that they receive. So this highlights the fact that the predominant model of caregiving in our country today is that of a primary caregiver, one person who assumes the lion's share of responsibility of care. Now, this sets us up for a risky proposition because consider this. What happens if the primary caregiver predeceases the care recipient? What happens if the primary caregiver has their own healthcare crisis, which oftentimes occurs with couples or partners? So that's why I'm also a huge advocate for collaborative care models. No one person need do everything, but we have to recognize the tendency is one person will answer that call to care. So we need to work with what is our reality. Now, another realization as we contemplate accepting this role as a family caregiver is to recognize that the journey of caregiving is going to crack us wide open. It will affect us, mind, body, and spirit. And that's because caring for another person, it transforms our view of life. It transforms our expectations. It transforms our hopes and our dreams. And it also transforms our perception of ourselves and our perception of our family members and our friends as well. And that is why I think in so many ways, caregiving is actually a sacred experience. It's not just punching the clock and doing a job. It takes everything we have to give an investment of our body, our mind, and our soul if we're going to do this well. Arthur Kleinman refers to this in a little bit different way, but I think he echoes my sentiment. He was a doctor that wrote a book called The Soul of Care, in which he tells the story of having cared for his wife at the end of her life. He notes that caregiving is the existential activity through which we most fully realize our humanity. It's that activity in which we recognize who we are and what we are about and what we're made of and what matters. And for most people, it boils down to relationships, how we companion each other and how we care for each other. Now, although I think caregiving is a sacred calling, I also recognize that caring is one of the hardest things we will ever do because of the inherent nature of caring. It takes everything we have to give, but it is so worth doing. Now, I don't presume to know the specifics of your journey of caregiving, past, present, or future. So please hear this. I am not trying to judge how you are caring for your family or perhaps how they're caring for you, because all of our journeys are going to be unique, how they unfold and how they ultimately end. But I think I am safe to say that when we are each called to care, this journey of caring serves as a wake-up call for each and every one of us. And once awakened, we learn quickly that caring impacts every facet of our being. And because of that, we are wise to approach caring with our eyes wide open. We need to understand what is expected of us, what we can anticipate throughout the journey, and prepare for that. If we go in just skipping along, ignorant about what will unfold, we are likely to have a pretty bumpy ride, encountering many challenges and barriers we never anticipated, which will increase the stress of that journey. So this goes back to my initial comment, knowledge is power. So let's consider, what are some of the consequences of caring that we can anticipate, that we can expect, that we can plan for? And let's begin by talking about some of the physical consequences of caring. Now, I noted previously that the predominant model of caregiving in our country is that of a primary caregiver. Someone is trying to do all things, be all things, all of the time. And one of the consequences of that approach to caring is compromised health. Now, I've been presenting programs now since 2004 on family caregiving. And I've met so many people who have engaged this journey, and so many that have experienced healthcare issues because of this journey and role of caregiver, because they fail to take care of themselves in the process of caring for others. I've also met a myriad of people who've had physical injuries because of caring for another person, oftentimes a back injury. So please be aware, if part of the process of caring for your loved one is transitioning them from a bed to a chair, please get some training on how to do that safely, or actually have some devices installed in your home that will assist you in that transition. Many a caregiver has also suffered from sleep deprivation. Sometimes there just aren't enough hours in the day to cover all the bases and then get an adequate night's sleep. Or even when you lie down, your mind will not shut off. You're going through your task list. What do I need to do for tomorrow? Or you're worried about the results of a recent test that was conducted. So many reasons that we aren't sleeping well. And certainly our diet will suffer sometimes when we're serving as a care provider. Again, because we don't have time to prepare a healthy meal. So instead, what do? We grab and go. We eat foods of convenience when time permits. And those are typically foods that are high in sugar, high in fat, and high in carbohydrates, which leads to healthcare issues such as heart disease or the development of type 2 diabetes. And certainly with limited time, sometimes we put daily exercise at the end of our list of things to do. And then we become somewhat lethargic and apathetic, and we become a couch potato. Now, I say this having done this in my life when I've been a caregiver. There just weren't enough hours in the day. But realize we know the importance of daily exercise to maintain good physical health, to maintain muscle mass, and the strength of our bones. So for the long haul, we've got to find a little bit of time, 20 or 30 minutes every single day. Now, with all these other things that I've mentioned previously, the stress, poor diet, not exercising, lack of sleep, this can compromise our immune system and make us much more susceptible to disease processes, picking up the flu or COVID or a stomach bug, whatever it might be. And so if you find yourself going to the doctor for these irritating and debilitating, oftentimes, diseases, and they're much more frequent, know that perhaps it's time to pay a little bit more attention to your own health and well-being. Chronic fatigue is also experienced by many a caregiver, and that's not just physical weariness. Oftentimes emotional angst as well as mental distress will dial into chronic fatigue, which is debilitating for a lot of folks. So with just those few points related to our physical health and wellness, I think you'll recognize we need to be wise when we answer this call to care. In order to care well, we must be well. So take good care of you when caring for someone else. put yourself at the top of the list. Another consequence of caring has to do with our emotional well-being. Now, this shouldn't be surprising to you because emotions are going to bubble up throughout the journey. We know that when the health of an individual in our family changes, that's one of the greatest challenges a family will ever confront. And so we're afraid, we're frightened, we're sad, we're grieving, we're anxious, we're frustrated, we're concerned. And all of these emotions seem to be flooding through our system all at one time. And so many people describe caring as this emotional roller coaster. And it can change moment by moment, day by day. 1 minute you're up, and the next minute you're down. And it feels like we are going through emotional storms, only because we are. Now, one thing to pay attention to is there is typically a constant emotion that I sense in caregivers. It's an undercurrent of grief. And that is because in this journey of caring for someone with a progressive or ultimately terminal condition, we are experiencing losses day by day as it leads to the ultimate loss of death. And we need to be mindful of that because we live in a society that is basically grief illiterate. Yes, we feel grief, we feel our sorrow, but we don't know what to do with it. And sometimes we don't even know how to name it. So just be aware as a care provider to someone, step by step, you will witness incremental losses, either physically and or cognitively. And those need to be recognized and they need to be mourned. And also pay attention to anticipatory grief. Now, this is anticipating the death of the person that you're caring for. Now, it could be a few months down the road, or it may be years. But in the back of your mind, you're already starting to grieve that ultimate loss, even though the person is still alive. And so it makes the present somewhat bittersweet. So let me give you an example. I noted that I helped to care for my mom when I was a kid. And I knew that her condition was terminal after about 3 or 4 years, although we really didn't talk about it. And so on every special occasion, whether it was Christmas or her birthday, the 4th of July, whatever it was, I would think to myself, is this the last time we'll have mom to celebrate this holiday with? And so I would be over functioning at all of these events, and I would be trying to remember every single moment because I thought it was going to be the last one. So anticipatory grief can be very difficult to deal with if you don't know what you're feeling and you don't have anybody to process that with. But it certainly is part of the emotional journey of being a care provider. So suffice it to say, caring can be and usually is emotionally stressful. Now, the other thing to recognize about the emotional nature of caring is that if you're called to care several times within your family, each journey is going to be emotionally unique, predicated on the relationship you had with the person you're caring for. So we need to be prepared that even though we've cared maybe 2 or 3 times before, a recent calling, there are going to be different lessons to learn. There are going to be different challenges to confront and different emotions that you're going to feel. So, for example, with my mom, my initial call to care, my biggest struggle was with grief, as I've noted, and also a tremendous amount of fear. And I feared not having my mother in my life anymore. I didn't know how I was going to handle that because my mom was the center of my universe. We had an amazingly close relationship. Now, that experience taught me a lot. But the next calling I had was to care for my dad. And that was a very different relationship. And I was 20 years older, a wee bit wiser. And I leveraged what I'd learned from my mom to apply to my journey with my dad. But since we were not as close, I didn't have the fear or the level of grief that I had with my mother. But since my mom had already died, I was thinking, wow, when dad dies, I'm going to be an orphan. And I felt somewhat disconnected and unmoored and unanchored. And that was a feeling I didn't have when I was caring for my mom. And I had a different sensation when I cared for my godmother many years later. I was her guardian at the end of life, and I was a long distance caregiver at this point. And the feeling that I struggled with my Aunt Jane was that I regretted how her journey ended because it wasn't the ending of her choice. And I had no way to change her reality. So I had a lot of regret, and I also had a lot of guilt. And then the last time that I companioned a family member was a mere, I don't know, 7 years ago when my brother died in 2016. And I was sitting at his bedside. He was 3 years my senior, and he was suffering tremendously. And so I dealt with survivor's guilt. Sitting at his bedside, I was thinking, why is my brother suffering so? And I'm so blessed. And I never have really come to terms with that. And the other sensation I had upon his death was isolation, because I am now the last one standing in my family of origin. So I share that personal review of the multiple times I've been called to care just to highlight the fact that each journey is going to be different, with different challenges as well as different opportunities. So we need to be prepared when we're called to care and we companion people to the end of the road. We're going to struggle with many emotions. But the invitation I have for you is this. I want to share a nugget of wisdom I received from one of my best mentors when I worked in hospice. This was a chaplain who recognized that I'm somewhat like my father, somewhat reticent. I tend to stuff my emotions instead of articulating them. And she said, Jane, I know that's your nature, but she said, it's going to serve you much better if you just feel what you feel when you feel it. She said, in that way, you don't create this freight train of emotional baggage that you're dragging around through the rest of your life. She said, you're brave enough to do this. You're strong enough to handle it. She said, just try it. And I have to say, my tendency is still to stuff my emotions, but I'm getting a little bit better at it. A wise woman indeed. Now, another consequence of caring has to do with our mental health. Now, I'm very encouraged that over the last 3 to 4 years, because of the global pandemic, we are talking much more openly about mental health, and we should, because it's part of our overall well-being. But it's been stigmatized for centuries. We whisper about it in the corners, or at least we used to. So today I'm giving voice to a topic that sometimes is a little bit uncomfortable, but just recognize that we will be challenged mentally as care providers. Now, what do I mean by mental health? Well, it's a state of mind characterized by emotional well-being. So it's hard to talk about mental health and not refer to emotional health. They are inextricably linked. It's a state of mind characterized by good behavioral adjustment, relative freedom from anxiety and disabling symptoms, and a capacity to establish constructive relationships and to cope with the ordinary demands and stresses of life. So the bottom line for mental health is this: it determines how we handle life, the decisions that we make, interactions with other people, and also how we manage stress. So obviously, having good mental health is a benefit for all of those who respond to the call to care. But sadly, the majority of caregivers in our country who have been surveyed say they feel they have no choice when called to care. By default, because of duty, because of cultural norms, whatever the reason, they feel as if they have no choice in answering that call. They must do it. And because of that, they have an increased sensation of caregiver burden, feeling as if they've been put upon, that they are burdened by this responsibility. And if you feel as if you had no control over this change in your role, that becomes heavier each and every day. And actually, we can start to wear the mantle of the martyr, and that does not serve us well. In fact, there's a greater likelihood of mental health concerns if we feel like we had no control over this. That's why we see an increased incidence of depression for many family caregivers. In fact, those surveyed recently, 40 to 70% of those caring have at some point in time felt as if they were somewhat depressed. Now, the population of caregivers at greatest risk for depression are those family caregivers caring for someone with the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And that is because of the length, the duration of care required, the intensity of care, and also the kind of care that's related to that disease. Also, an increased level of anxiety is experienced by many, many family caregivers. And I think this correlates to the inherent changing nature of caregiving. If you're caring for someone with a progressive, ultimately terminal condition, it's always changing physically and cognitively, the situation, which means the goals of care will change, the plan of care will change, and you have to adapt and to accommodate that. And so we become very distrustful of times of serenity and calm and peace because we're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. And so when we're that anxious, it's as if we are living at a higher frequency, vibrating nonstop, and that becomes exhausting. Now, with many of these mental and emotional issues that we've just touched on, this also can lead to behavioral concerns, such as the misuse or abuse of substances, such as alcohol and also drugs, whether they're illicit or they're prescription medications. Now, if you have any resonance with the issues we've talked about emotionally or mentally, my invitation to you today is this: seek professional help. You need not try to gut it out to do this on your own. And it's not a failing on your part to admit, hey, I'm concerned. Help me with this. Go to your doctor, get a referral to a therapist or a counselor that specializes in this. Help to mitigate some of the concerns you have and improve your process of caring for another person. It will serve you well in the long run. Some other consequences of caring we need to be mindful of have to do with our educational and professional dimensions of life. Now, in regard to education, I'm referring to a specific population of caregivers, and those are individuals 18 years of age and younger. If you look at the data and the research, it's estimated between 3 and 4 million children younger than 18 years of age are caring for a sibling, for a parent, or a grandparent. So obviously, when called to care at that young age, like I was, it means that adolescence ends prematurely. They're no longer kids. They are kids physically, but they are thrown into an adult situation with adult responsibilities. And that can definitely impact the development of that individual into adulthood. Now, I remember realizing this, but not articulating it when I was called to care at the age of 15. I felt so disconnected to my peer group, to my friends, even though they were fabulous. They couldn't relate to what was going on in my family. They didn't have experience upon which to perceive my situation. And so while they were worried about getting a date to go to homecoming, I was worried about having enough syringes in the house to administer shots to my mom for anti-nausea situations related to her chemo treatments. It's as if we lived in two different worlds, only because we did. Now, if you also explore this area of caregiving and look at the research, many of the children that are called to care oftentimes will abbreviate their education. They may or may not graduate from high school, and it may not be possible to go on to college, or maybe they have to delay it until that caregiving journey has concluded. So that can have lifelong consequences for that individual. Now, in regard to careers, there are many a caregiver that are dealing with working and caring simultaneously. In fact, 60% of family caregivers are employed at least part-time, if not full-time. And so when caring, sometimes our career options may be impacted. In fact, there is a reluctance, a hesitancy on the part of many employees to actually disclose to their boss that they're caring for an aging parent or perhaps a spouse, because they think they're going to be overlooked for a promotion or a transfer or a plum position. There's the assumption that, oh, if they know I'm caring, they'll think I can't handle this at the office. Well, the reality is when we try to do both, there is evidence that something's going on at home because there's increased absenteeism, there is lost productivity. There is also perhaps an increase in medical issues for the care provider because they've compromised their own health and well-being in the process. And so people start to realize, hey, what's going on with Jane? What's going on with Joe? Haven't seen her around for a while, maybe even taking unpaid leave. And so there may come a point in time where you're thinking, how am I going to balance both working and caring at the same time? How can I do this? And you may actually determine that you've got to make a choice. And you think it's binary. I either work or I care, one or the other. Now, I don't know that I profess to know exactly what you should do, but I'm going to caution you not to jump to a conclusion and think you can't do both, because there are some long-term consequences that are significant in this. Certainly, if you opt to resign from your position, you have short-term pain. You have a reduced stream of revenue, so you may not be able to cover the cost of your day-to-day expenses. But if you look long-term, that price tag is even bigger. There were many financial institutions that did some research about 7 years ago, and they were curious as to the financial consequences of particularly women who leave the workplace to care for aging parents or their spouse or partner. And what they determined, the final roll-up as far as the price tag long-term, comprised of salary, lost wages, benefits from the place of employment, as well as a reduction in Social Security benefits. It came to $324,000. Now, for most of us, to miss out on that chunk of change means that we probably are not going to be able to retire, and we have compromised our ability to pay for our own aging process and our own healthcare needs. So this is a significant decision, something that we shouldn't do ill-advised. So I want you to remember, it may be difficult once you resign to reclaim your current job. It may be impossible. The job may no longer exist. So I want to share a story with you. A woman I met at a workshop, this was probably 12 years ago, and she found herself in this situation. She had been an executive in an IT office in New York, I believe. And her mom was in Missouri, and she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she was approaching the end of life. And this woman had been doing the long distance dance for a while, and it just wasn't working well. So she talked to her boss, and she said, can I get a leave of absence for 6 months? I'm going to take care of my mother, and then I'll be back. And they agreed to do that. Well, she went back home, and 6 months actually became 4 years. Her mother lived longer than expected. And once her mother died, then her father had a healthcare crisis. So she stayed and cared for her father for 5 years. And when I met her, she was in her late 50s, and she was trying to get back in the workforce. And she said, there is no way any IT company will ever hire me because I'm irrelevant now. I'm dated. I've been out of the business for 9 years. And she said, it is incredibly difficult to figure out what to do now because of my age and because I've been out of work for so long. So keep this in mind. Maybe you can do both. but you may have to delegate some of your caregiving responsibilities. Create a collaborative community of care. Allow other people to help you in that responsibility. Or go to the expense of hiring some professional care providers to fill in the gap periodically. That's probably a better financial plan than resigning from your job. Just something to think about. Now, there's some other financial consequences of caring as well, not looking at your employment. But we need to recognize, predicated on surveys done by AARP, that most family caregivers have out-of-pocket expenses that add up to about $7,500 a year. And for long-distance caregivers, that price tag goes up to $12,000 a year because of the added expense of traveling back and forth. So you need to dial that into your budget if you are assuming the role of family caregiver. Also know that you need to be very cognizant of long-term care cost. Now, when you answer this call to care, you commit to be that care provider. Your intention may be to keep that person at home for the entirety of that journey. But there may come a point in time where that's no longer advisable, it's not doable, or it's not safe. So what will it cost for an assisted living, for a skilled nursing, or a memory-specific care unit? How much would it cost to bring care into the home? Well, those costs are extraordinary. And so we need to anticipate that. We need to plan for that. Otherwise, savings will be depleted. And sadly, I hear this story far too often, that the care recipient runs through their savings that they had expected to pass along to their kids or their grandkids, and the family caregivers start to dive into their own savings, their 401k, again, to augment some of the cost of care. So the message here is look to the future, anticipate cost of care. And today, if you're not currently called to care, you know you will be at some point in time if you have aging parents, if you're in a relationship. So what can you expect? What should you plan for? What kind of insurance policies might you want to invest in? This will serve you well. Now, there are also social consequences of caring that we need to be mindful of as well. We can imagine that when there's a change in health, relationships are going to change. So changes in roles and responsibilities. The person with a diagnosis may no longer be able to fulfill their role or to do what they typically have done in the family. So who's going to fill in that gap? Who will pick up the responsibilities that have been abdicated? Intimate roles oftentimes are going to be overshadowed by the practical roles of caregiver and care recipient. That is why I stress to families that when you're in this journey of caring, carve out every single day at least 10 minutes just to be together. Whether it's a mother and daughter, a husband and wife, a partner and a partner, but just be together to enjoy some music or to have a cup of coffee or to chat about your day. Anything not related to the journey of caregiving, so you can reinforce those emotional ties. Also recognize when there's a change in health in the family, some relationships are going to be strained because with that caregiver, care receiver scenario, there seems to be a power differential. The caregiver's in control and the care recipient sometimes feels disempowered. Sometimes they are at the whim of the care provider. And so that can cause people to get a little bit snippy, a little bit impatient, sometimes angry and frustrated. This is when personal boundaries need to be revisited, redefined, and then managed well. Now, boundaries are important for both parties. They're mutually beneficial. You need to know where you end, the other person begins, understand expectations of each other, and then honor those limitations. So caring, it's going to affect the entire family system as far as boundaries, relationships, roles, and responsibilities, even if you have a primary caregiver in this scenario. Everyone's witnessing it. Everyone is affected by the changes that are going on with the person with the diagnosis and the person who is caring for them. Now, also recognize this is a difficult time for everybody. Nobody is on their best game. So be gentle with each other. Be kind, be caring, be compassionate, and empathic. Cut each other a little bit of slack. Also recognize that when you're called to care, it can be somewhat isolating because you have so many additional responsibilities and there are only 24 hours in each day. Sometimes you don't have time to nurture those friendships outside the home. And so your world becomes smaller and smaller as the requirements of care continue to increase. And this is when people who are in the journey for years at a time start to look around and they wonder, where did everybody go? It seems as if the friends have faded away. So again, be intentional in reinforcing those much needed connections. And also realize that in the midst of caring, sometimes this spotlights family estrangement. Individuals that have chosen to leave the family system, to disconnect emotionally and physically, not to be in relationship for whatever reason, they may be sorely missed when there is a healthcare crisis. And also recognize that a change in health for a family member may actually precipitate family estrangement. When the other family members cannot get on the same page, they can't agree to a plan of care or how to care. Sometimes that actually results in relationships being severed or destroyed. So just be mindful of this issue of estrangement as well. Now, the last consequence I want to touch on has to do with the spiritual consequences of caring, how caring can test what we fundamentally believe to be true, the foundation from which we typically live our life. Now, when we're serving as a family caregiver, we're companioning someone and witnessing their demise when they're dealing with a significant disease process. And oftentimes we witness their suffering. And it's not uncommon. In fact, it's so natural in the midst of that that we start to question and we start to doubt and we start to ask why. And so the pillars of our faith, they're going to be tested. They're going to be shaken. And sometimes to the extreme, they will be shattered. And this can lead to a spiritual crisis, sometimes referred to as existential suffering. This is defined as an experience involving a perceived threat to the integrity of the self, helplessness in the face of that threat, and exhaustion of psychosocial and personal resources for coping. So we feel as if the props have really been knocked out from under us. We feel as if we are standing on shifting sands. Everything that we believe to be true up until this point in time, we feel duped. We feel abandoned by the God that we have chosen to worship, our sense of the sacred and the divine. And we feel isolated and alone. Now, again, just like with spiritual suffering, emotional suffering, mental suffering, there are experts that can help us. So this is a time to reach out. Reach out to your faith leader. Work with a spiritual director. Work with a pastoral counselor, but you don't have to go through this by yourself. Now, another implication of the spiritual consequences is that our view of life, it's going to be forever changed. And we recognize in that moment that we can't go back to the way life used to be before the diagnosis, before we were called to care. And there are many reasons for that, one being that we are forever changed. We are different individuals, so we can't reclaim what was. And as we look to the future, it's transformed as well because we don't see life in the same way. And we don't see the same dreams, and we may not desire the same things because of this transformation. And so that can be quite a shock. It's troubling when your plan for life, what you have dreamed for all of your life, has changed. Now, in that moment, I always reflect back on the lessons learned and offered by Viktor Frankl. You may know him to be the author of the book Man's Search for Meaning. And it's his memoir in some way of his experience of 3.5 years of imprisonment in Auschwitz and how he survived. He was the only one in his family to survive. So this gentleman new suffering and loss. And what he learned from that, one of the many things that he offered to generations to come, was this: we can't control everything that happens in our lives, but we always retain the spiritual freedom to choose a response. And that response determines the trajectory of our life from that point forward. So don't feel hopeless. Do not feel helpless. You always have the ability to choose a response that will serve you well. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit. I know many of the consequences that I've touched on, they're challenges, they're problematic. Sometimes they're a little bit anxiety provoking, but we need to be aware of those challenges that are out there. Now I want to consider the positive consequences of care. They are there if we choose to seek them out and to discover them. But recognize timing is everything. Sometimes we don't recognize the blessings of having cared for someone until many years after that journey has ended. Remember the old adage, hindsight is 20/20? Well, there is truth to that. So what's to be learned as we look back on our experience of caring for someone? Well, in that journey, we have a sense of purpose, a reason to be. We're called to care for someone who needs us and wants us. And that sense of meaning and purpose oftentimes is what sustains us over the longevity of that journey. It keeps us going. We know someone is counting on us, relying on us. This also is an opportunity for expanding our social network, connecting with other family caregivers. This is one of the greatest things I witness when I present to family caregiver support groups. These people have initially come together with a common concern and a common cause, a common experience. And what is so beautiful about that connecting is many of those family caregivers then become friends, and they remain in relationship well past the time their respective journeys end. And that friendship supports and sustains them with the next stage of life. By also answering the call of care, we save money. Remember, the cost of care, extraordinarily expensive. We can't afford to pay for all the care that we require. So by stepping up, by being willing to care for another person, it's a financial boon for the family. It also can delay or maybe avoid a transition to a long-term care community. Again, saving some money, but more importantly, allowing the person with the diagnosis to be where they want to be, at home. Home is where the heart is. Home is our comfort zone. Home is where we create memories. Home is where we belong. And this is a huge gift of answering the call to care. Caring also refines our focal point. And by that, I mean it gives us clarity as to what is truly important in life. And I know, predicated on all the journeys of care that I've been on, at the conclusion of each one, I have a better understanding of what makes life worth living. And like many other people, probably just like you, it boils down to relationships, of who we choose to love, who loves us, and how we serve each other in that experience of living together. Care can offer wisdom for the art of living. So in the aftermath of caring, all those lessons learned, we can apply them to our future lived experience. They will serve to shape and inform the journey that we choose to take from that point forward. Also, by caring, bonds may be strengthened with the person that you're caring for, and also the community of care that you create, working with your siblings or other family members or neighbors that want to be part of that plan of care. And it may be an opportunity for healing to happen. We talked about the issue of family estrangement. Well, for a person that has been separated from a family, when they hear that time is short, that a significant diagnosis has been made, there is a sense of urgency for reconciliation sometimes. And that is a blessing indeed, if that were to happen. And certainly we can experience different facets of another person that we're caring for. I had the blessing of this with my dad. I mentioned that I wasn't nearly as close to my dad as with my mom. But in the last few years of my dad's life, he revealed a side of his nature I had not seen before, a gentler, a kinder, a much more vulnerable man than I had experienced in my youth. And that was such a delight for me because my dad learned how to articulate how he truly felt. And he said the things I had longed to hear the entirety of my life. He learned how to express how much he loved us, my brother and me. And that is a gift that I will treasure for the rest of my life. We also, as care providers, there's an important lesson to learn here. We are natural caregivers, most of us, but we are very reluctant care recipients. So by caring for someone who graciously receives our help, we can learn how to graciously ask for and receive the help that we need when the time comes. And that is a benefit for all concerned. We also learn how to talk about the tough stuff, to go there with people, to talk about the reality of mortality, to talk about death and dying. Now, having served in hospice for many years, having been an educator talking about end of life issues, I've had many conversations with care recipients, and they long to have someone who is fearless enough to listen to their concerns about dying and about their questions about death. They need people to process with. And if we can do that with family members, so much the better. We also have the ability to serve as a listener, to listen to the stories that people share as they approach the end of their journey. This seems to be so natural. Most folks that I've companioned, either personally or professionally, they long to look back over their shoulder and to relate where they have been, what they've accomplished, what were some of their disappointments, who they loved, who loved them, the person that they became. And by listening to those stories, we learn about life and we learn about ourselves. If it's a family member that we're listening to, that is a treasured legacy that hopefully we document along the way. We can record those conversations. We can videotape those discussions. We can write down notes so that we don't forget names and dates and times. But this is an opportunity, a blessing for being there, of companioning those when they need us the most. So there are many blessings to be realized by caring for someone. But again, sometimes it takes us a little bit of time to appreciate them. But once recognized, I think we then have a responsibility to apply those lessons learned to our own plans, to our own lived experience, because we've been transformed by that journey. And we can take those lessons and intentionally craft a life that we can truly enjoy and live a life of significance predicated on what we learned. And finally, I want to encourage you that when and after you answer that call to care, I want you to take pride in your willingness and your ability to care, to be there, to answer that call, to meet the challenges, because it does take everything you have to give. And I recognize that. Now, the last thing I want to touch on before we have time for questions is just realize that because this journey typically is going to be fairly long, 4.5 years on average, this becomes the norm for you as a care provider. So at the journey's end, if the person you're caring for improves or if they die, your life is going to change. Your daily rhythm is going to change. Expectations and responsibilities are going to change. And you may feel a bit as if you're at loose ends. You don't know what to do. And sometimes people get a little bit twitchy about that because we like a routine. So if you're feeling anxious right now because your journey has ended, my best advice to you is this, because this is advice I have received from others in the past. First and foremost, take a deep breath. Just breathe and allow yourself to slow down, because the pace of caregiving typically is pretty frantic at the end of the journey. And finally, take the needed time to grieve and mourn your losses. Again, feel what you feel when you feel it. And I know with grief, our tendency is to run away from it, to deny it, to delay it. But we're better served to touch it, feel it, move through it so we can live beyond it. Now, once done, it's time to figure out where you are. So get your bearings. That's the starting point. Identify where you want to go, applying those lessons learned, and then chart a new course. How do you get from point A to point B? And once done, you take one step at a time, trusting that your path will unfold when you are ready and you are able to walk forward. You have the opportunity, the ability, and the courage to create a life you love. And that is a life that is informed by the experience that you just had, hopefully an experience and lessons learned that will enrich your journey from this day forward. Now, I always have one more thing to say, so I refer to this as my heartfelt closing ritual. And I wanted to leave you with a sentiment from Eleanor Roosevelt. She is one of my favorite voices in the world. She always inspires me and encourages me. And I found a quote that I think is very relevant to this whole issue of being called to care. She notes that you gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You must do the thing you think you cannot do. So remember, you are braver and you are bolder than you can even imagine. So when called to care, when that fear and anxiety start to bubble up, when you start to question yourself, know that you're enough. Know that you can do this, and your life will be forever changed because of it. Caring for each other. Yes, it's a challenge, but it's also the opportunity of a lifetime. So a few resources for you to check out. Again, they're included in the handout for the program. If you're interested in other programs that I offer, they're all free of charge. 90% are online these days. You can check out my website, cardinallife.com, click on the events tab. If you see a topic that tickles your fancy, you can click on the link. It will send me an email and I'll sign you up. If you are a reader, I wrote Caregiving for the Genius a few years ago. It's available in most libraries. You can also purchase a copy at amazon.com. If you are into podcast, I have Cardinal Musings with Jane Barton. You can access this podcast through any service provider that you choose to use for podcasting. And I hope that you'll save the date for our next program associated with the CSU Extension Group, and that is Your Final Act. We're going to talk about the importance of end-of-life rituals. This will be September 13th from 11:30 to 1 o'clock, and we certainly hope that you will opt to join us. More than anything, I want to thank you for sharing a little bit of your journey with me today. I'm always honored and delighted. Know that I'm sending you many blessings to you and yours on your journey. And if I can ever be of help to you, offering a resource or a listening ear, you can contact me via email at cardinallife@msn.com. I would love to continue the conversation. And with that, it's time for questions. So I'm going to unshare my screen and we'll see what Ginger has to send my way.
Thank you so much, Jane. I always love listening to you. You're such an amazing speaker and have so much wealth of knowledge on this topic. I really resonated with, feeling what you feel when you feel it. I know caregiving can be really hard. I've been there, but it's also important to recognize our needs as well too, and graciously ask ourselves how we can help ourselves. So thank you so much for acknowledging that as well. So I want to remind everybody that we do have a Q&A session It looks like we do have a question coming in. Is Jane the speaker for all of the sessions or just this one? Jane will be our speaker for all of our sessions through the end of the year. She's been with us since the spring and has a wealth of knowledge in so many topics. So yes, Jane will be with us. Let's
For
see.
better or for worse.
Yeah. CSU Extension is really making sure that we can provide education and knowledge in the caregiving and healthy aging space. And so this is just, the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to be bringing in for healthy aging. And so if anybody has any ideas or things that they'd like to hear, we'd love to hear your feedback as well too on that. I will be emailing an Qualtrics link for a survey for your feedback, and the handouts that Jane had mentioned will be coming in that email as well. So we have a couple questions. First question, Jane, what have you learned about yourself in the process of caring for someone?
Well, that is a question that I ask a lot of folks that I meet along the way just to kind of compare notes. But I think it relates to some of the comments I made in the program in that sometimes we are capable of doing things beyond our wildest imagination. And when I listen to a story of family caregivers, whether it's here in Denver or it's online and someone calling in from New York, and they describe to me their activities day in and day out, I'm overwhelmed just by listening to their story, all the things that they are doing. And they don't say it in a complaining way. It's just, this is my reality. This is what we're dealing with. And they're still able to find a bit of joy and hope in each and every day that keeps them going, that sustains them. So I think for me, the overall lesson is this: we are resilient creatures. We are able to bounce back from adversity and to deal with change in very life-giving ways, and sometimes profoundly wondrous ways. And if I think about the journeys of caring that I've been on, I was having a conversation with one of my dearest friends the other day, and she said, "What do you think your life would be like today if your mom had not been diagnosed with cancer when you were so young? Where do you think you would be now?" And it was kind of an interesting discussion. And what I realized is that even though that was a heartbreaking loss for our entire family, this is my life. And I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be today. And so all of those things that happened, good or bad, tragic or wonderful in my life, were required to bring me here. And so I have to accept that whole package if I'm going to live the life that I love right now. And maybe that's just part of the process of acceptance and reconciliation with the reality that we're living.
One out of something that's so tough, you've been able to help so many people, Jane. And so we really appreciate that as well. Let's see, we have another question. Any advice for caregivers when the person got better, but the caregiver lives with the fear of illness coming back?
This is something, a lot of work has been done related to particularly a cancer diagnosis, because oftentimes people will get diagnosed with a particular kind of cancer. They'll go through the treatment scenario, and then they're determined to be in remission. And then everybody is on edge. It's like, okay, well, initially we go back every 3 months to do a scan. So you hold your breath until you get the all clear. And then they extend it out to 6 months, and then it's every year, and then maybe every 3 years if you're fortunate. But what research also bears out is that the emotional angst is actually greater once someone has been in remission and they have a recurrence. And it's harder for the patient as well as for the family. And what the surveys bear out, it's because the family knows what to expect. They've been through this particular part of the journey before. They know how difficult it's going to be. They're probably much more knowledgeable about the odds of being able to beat it a second time. And so that tendency of being anxious and being on edge, wondering if or when you're going to have to go through that experience again. It's felt by so many patients as well as their family members. And I don't know if I have a magical or a wise answer on how to deal with that, but I think it begins by naming it, by recognizing what you're struggling with and discussing it as a family, and maybe including a therapist in that discussion as well, on coping mechanisms or approaches or attitudes toward that. But to realize that you're not the only one in your family that's dealing with that can be incredibly beneficial, that you're not alone. I think that is a good starting point.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. Let's see, we have another question. When caring for someone, what resources or information have been proven to be the most beneficial?
This is an interesting question and something I'm dealing with more often than not from people who come to my programs. I have so many families that are overwhelmed by just all the data they find on the internet, and they don't know what home health care agency to use. How do you select a hospice? Where do you go to find a nurse that can be a 24/7 addition to the home? They just don't know where to start. And so if you live in a community that has a lot of resources, I think a good place to start is the Area Agency on Aging in the county in which you live. I think that can be a point of contact, either looking at their website or calling into their main number, just letting them know what you're looking for. There are also specialists called geriatric care managers or case managers. And these are individuals that specialize in helping families to navigate our healthcare system and to identify the resources that are needed. So if you have the ability to work with such a professional, they typically charge by the hour. They can really streamline your process, and they've vetted a lot of the resources that you might need related to your specific care need. They can be a wonderful resource to help you alleviate some of the questions that you have and point you in the right direction. But that is one of our biggest challenges today, is our system is so siloed, it's so disconnected, it's so massive that it's overwhelming. And if you live in the rural part of Colorado, it's the opposite challenge. You have limited resources. You may not have service providers. So how do you get the care that you need in those situations geographically?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jane. It looks like we have one more question in the queue. I just want to remind people we have about maybe 5 or 6 more minutes, and then we'll be done. So if you have any last minute questions, make sure to add them now. So our question is, any tips to get a family member to understand they need help? I'm trying to be caring and understanding, but meeting a lot of resistance. They think they can still do it and don't need help.
This is a common situation in families, a reluctance for, let's say, aging parents to allow their adult children to help them. This is very difficult to overcome. Sometimes it has to do with cultural norms that I'm the father, I'm the mother, I'm the matriarch, the patriarch, whatever it is, and I'm still in charge. So many people don't want to ask for help or to admit they need help because they don't want to give up control. We desperately want to remain independent and autonomous. We want to feel as if we're charting our own course, and we don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to let our guard down to say, yeah, I really need some help. Maybe I should stop driving, or I need help with home maintenance, or can you take me to the doctor? That's hard for us to do. And that's that resistance to assistance. Now, how do you initiate a conversation that doesn't reinforce that resistance? Sometimes it's, I think, the approach. And instead of telling someone, Dad, you need some help, and I'm here to help you, and this is how it's going to be. I know sometimes we have that tendency because we're frustrated and impatient. Instead, go in asking, what's going on, Dad? Things are different. And I know I know you want to stay in control. Just name it. Don't dance around it, but just say, I care about you. And I want to make sure that you're safe, that you're enjoying life, that we as a family can support you. So let us help you. Ask to help. Don't dictate that or mandate it. And it probably won't resolve the issue in one conversation. It's going to be ongoing. So just do it a little bit at a time. Practice patience, which is hard, but be very sensitive to the underlying emotion. And sometimes it's a lot of fear. It's a lot of fear about, oh my gosh, I can't manage my life anymore. And so it also is a process of loss and grieving as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's see, we do have another question. If you are caring for more than one family member in your home, is there financial support available?
There may be, again, I would start, point of contact would be calling your area agency on aging. They have usually a specialist in caregiving. They have specialists in aging resources as well, but they also will be knowledgeable about some funding that might be available for in-home family caregivers. And also you can learn more about the qualifications to apply for Medicaid, which is an entitlement that is determined by your financial situation.
Okay, it looks like we've reached all of our questions. Thank you so much, Jane, for all of your resources, support, and wealth of knowledge. We're excited to have you back on September 13th. I will be sending out, like I said, the survey link, the handouts, and if you have not registered for the other sessions and would like to, those links will be included in the email as well. Just a reminder, this is a free resource and you are happy to share it with anyone you feel like would benefit from this program. So thank you so much, and we will see you in September.
Hey, blessings, everyone.